I guess I just would love to know what you think about the news these days.
Well, there's a lot of it. For one thing, it's pretty chaotic. I'm writing a book at the moment about the last year of Richard Nixon. I was White House correspondent, 73 to 74. We thought that was chaotic. What has changed is social media and the proliferation of all these channels, you know, MSNBC and Fox News, and I'm sure that you're on the air with news a lot more in Nashville as well. And then you can go online and get all kinds of commentary. That's good news and bad news. The good news is that it's democratic, small d. People have access. But we don't know where a lot of it comes from. You know, there are a lot of people who are mischievous or worse, and I think that's a danger to a democracy.
And what about this whole notion of fake news?
Well, fake news is often in the eyes of the beholder. You know, it's a handy line for the president. Oh, it's all fake news. But you know, I know the people that he's talking about, and they're very good journalists, and they're not deliberately putting out fake news. It's often the truth is in the eye of the beholder. You know, everybody has a slightly different opinion about it. But to say something is just simply not true because he thinks it's not true, you know, that's not good for democracy. And whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, also the Democrats do the same thing. They blame the press, you know, for what's going on. In our profession, in your profession, people work very hard, risk their lives to try to tell the American people what they need to know.
Any advice for viewers these days or consumers of news?
I think the best advice I have is that people like you and like me should take a deep breath before they put something on the air and examine it and say, does the audience need to know what I'm about to tell them? Is it important enough for us to spend time on it? Or is it just sensational? Is it just there to make them raise their eyebrows and get angry? You know, in the long haul, journalism really is what holds the country together. Now, a lot of people out there are going to say, come on, give me a break. But in fact, it is. It's always been the case. We can't function as a democracy unless we have a place to go to find out what the truth is, or the best that we can determine what the facts are, and do that across the board. Now, there's more opinion now than I would like to see. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, perfect example, what's been going on in the last 24 hours with the bomber. News was all over that, and I'm sure that that helped the law enforcement people find this guy. I'm confident that it did. And the public needed to know what was being done so they wouldn't panic. That's where we come in.
You mentioned Nixon. I mean, and you, in all your time covering presidents, would you say that this is the craziest or worst it's ever been in terms of, you know, politicians versus journalists?
Yeah, I think it's the worst it's ever been in that regard. As I said, I'm working on this book about Nixon. He hated us as well. I mean, he blamed us for most of what was going wrong that he was responsible for. The difference is between now and the past is there's just so much more out there. I have a friend who is a longtime friend, and he's an alt-right guy. He's really off to the right, way off. He sends me material constantly that I can send right back to him and say, Bill, here's why it's not true. You know, this is the fourth story I've gotten like that from people who are out there just trying to cause mischief, or worse than that. So we have to be, as consumers of news, a lot more on guard, a lot more skeptical about what we're getting, and not just use whatever comes across the screen as an automatic way of us making a decision.
But in terms of Nixon versus Trump, you would say?
Well, Nixon hated us, but look, at 7 o'clock at night when I was White House correspondent, I'd finished for nightly news. And then at 7 o'clock at night, I'd get on the phone and I'd work my sources for the next morning on the Today Show. Now at 7 o'clock at night, our White House correspondents hit a switch and they're on Chris Matthews on MSNBC. And Chris is very opinionated and he's trying to reach people to do things. That's why they're successful. That's a big difference, quite honestly. I'd like people to take a breath from time to time. But, you know, this new form is out of the gate and nobody's going to put it back in again. So it's up to the consumers to the viewers to make decisions and to develop a system. Look, most people spend more time on selecting a television set or a refrigerator than they do on the source of their news. You know, they just, if it comes off the screen, they say, oh my God, it's got to be right, just because it was on the screen.
Just because it's timely, and I'm curious, I want to know what you think about this whole Megyn Kelly ordeal.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Oh,
That's no. You know, it's an NBC executive decision. She knew what she was getting into when she came to us. We knew, or our executives knew, what they were buying. You know, when they put her on the air, she wanted to be provocative, and she's not been very successful. You know, and then it blew up in her face when she made the comments she did. But that's as much as I want to say.
Fair enough. And then I just have some
okay.
geek out questions that I want to ask you. But yeah, like favorite story of all time, favorite interview of all time.
Well, you know, I divided it into several categories. We were talking about it earlier today. The single biggest story in my lifetime was 9/11, that I was on the air, you know, morning, noon, and night, and we didn't know where it was coming from. We knew it was an attack on America. A whole country was watching, and with good reason. And it took everything that I had learned as a journalist to keep my wits together and try to provide the audience with the information that they needed. I must say it's also true of my colleagues across the way, Dan Rather and Peter Jennings, who did a great job that day. Television, you know, is best when it's telling the American people what they need to know in a crisis. So that was a big story. And then, in a larger sense, the rise of China and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I did the first interview with Gorbachev, and I think that will always be one of the highlights of my life. But probably the biggest one was I was the only one there the night the Berlin Wall came down. We had a worldwide exclusive. I kept looking around saying, somebody else is going to show up here any minute, right? And they didn't, and we owned that story, and it was the end of the Cold War. It was a different time.
Anything you can tell me about the stuff that people didn't see or they didn't hear, you know, from any of those big events, something a producer said in your ear, something you remember that none of us would ever know unless we got the chance to sit down and ask you about it?
Why would I tell you that?
Why not?
No, you know, by and large, it's a kind of a fraternal business. We all work together. When they're in my ear, they're saying, Tom, I think we ought to go here. And I can say, you know, Joe, I don't think that's the right place right now. Let's try this over here. There are some funny things that happen as well, in which you'd like to reel that one back in again. But I really don't think that I want to go through that. What I find is the television audience is very tolerant. They know we're under a lot of pressure. They get angry if they think we're being opinionated in a way they don't like. But, you know, I've been at this since I was 22, and I'm now 78. And I must say I am very flattered that by and large the American people have accepted me as someone who tells the news straight or tries to tell the news straight.
I am curious about that, just because, you know, I panic all the time when I'm on camera, but how do you keep calm when the world is changing and you're the one who has to tell people about it? I mean, have you ever had a moment where you lost it?
Well, you know, my colleagues often comment on that. The crazier it gets, the cooler I get. And I don't know why that is. I think it has something to do with the fact that when I was very young, I was working in very small change, non-supportive television stations. I was working in news when I was a junior in college, Sioux City, Iowa. You didn't have a lot of support, so you had to learn how to deal with things very quickly. And you were out there on your own. And my friends who've known me forever always said, you know, I was a guy who could just start talking and it made sense. You know, whether I was on a team and I was talking about what we have to do, or whether I was in a debate class, you know, I could see things in my mind that I could convey with the audience in a way that I thought they would understand it.
Did you ever have a moment where you were truly afraid?
When I what?
Were truly afraid? Was there ever a news story that you were covering where you were worried for your safety or anything?
Well, I was afraid for our country on 9/11. I didn't know where this was going to end up, and I knew that it was a big deal. We knew that the jihad in that part of the world was out to bring down America, the civilization that we all cherish. they were willing to kill whoever they had to achieve their aims. That made me very, very nervous. You know, I'm a father, a husband as well. I have family members that I was worried about. I wasn't worried about myself. And then in war zones, you know, Beirut was always very dangerous because you didn't have a front line. You didn't know where they were going to come from. I was in a bad neighborhood in Beirut one day, and these young people, really, with heavily armed, came out. One of them put a gun in my ear, and I looked down, and he had a surplus American Boy Scout shirt from Davenport, Iowa on. I thought, I don't want to be killed by a guy who's wearing a Davenport, Iowa, you know, jacket of some, or shirt of some kind. But I haven't, no, I haven't really worried about it. This is it. I may not make it. I do that more in my recreational thing, mountain climbing and that kind of thing. I sometimes say, oh God, what am I doing here? But in war zones, you develop a sense of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Any
regrets or things you would have done differently so far? I mean, you know, in your news career, in your career, anything?
Well, I didn't go to Vietnam, and I should have. NBC had a policy they wouldn't send married people with children. They would send only single correspondents. And I wanted to go, but they said, no, we want to keep you here. And then I was heading off to the White House as well. So that was a regret. On the other hand, I covered the war at home, as I said, you know, all the demonstrations and the politics of Vietnam. I had friends over there, including my brother, and I lost a very dear friend there. And so I was very, very angry about the war before it was all over. It was such a waste of, you know, 55,000 young Americans, and that is something that I don't think I'll ever be able to accommodate in my own mind about what the hell were we doing there.
What is life like after a news career like that?
Well, you know, I have a hard time dialing down, as my friends always say. So I'm working on a new book, and then today they called and said, we want you on Meet the Press the Sunday before the election. So I'm still on the air a lot, but I pick my places more. I do something on Morning Joe on a kind of regular basis. And I try to stay in touch with the American public so that I know what they're thinking, and that they can also hear what we're thinking as journalists about where we're going and what we ought to be thinking. I'll talk about that some tonight. But by and large, it's a great, great profession. Look, I grew up, my father was a construction worker in South Dakota. My mother was a postmistress. I lived in small working class towns. I had my eye on the far horizon. This is what I wanted to do. I never thought it would work out as well as it has, so I have no complaints.
Any advice for people going into this election? I know.
Well, this election is a little mysterious right now, I think. You know, 10 days ago, it looked like the Democrats had a head of steam going. Kavanaugh hearing hurts them, frankly. A lot of women in the suburbs, especially, who have sons, thought he was mistreated. And then I always say when we're in an election year, first thing to look at is the economy, and the economy is doing well. So there are people out there who may not like Trump, but they say, look, I've got the best paycheck I've had in some time. My job is secure. I don't think I want to turn him out of office. There are a lot of reasons for people to have some questions about his stewardship. On the other hand, there are a lot of questions about what the heck are the Democrats up to? They don't seem to have a message, you know, about what they want to do. They say, well, we'll change health care, and then that's it. Mostly they're saying we're not Trump. That's not a platform to run on. So we'll see. 2 weeks is a long time. You know, things can change between now and then. You saw that in the last 24 hours with the pipe bombs. I don't know where this convoy will get to. I don't think it'll be much of a factor. But my favorite theory, and I say this to your audience, is the UFO theory, which is the unforeseen will occur. It almost always does. Donald Trump is a classic case of the UFO. He got elected president of the United States when no one thought he was going to get elected, except a small number of people in his inner circle. That's a UFO, and that's what we have to be aware of.
Do you want to tell me more about your book? I know you told me a little bit about it, when it's coming out, and...
Well, it's going to come out when I get it done. You know, it's instructive. That's one of the reasons I'm writing it, is that we had a crisis in the White House. The president was lying to the American people. He was trying to cover up his activity in terms of sending burglars into the Democratic Party headquarters. At the same time, what people forget is that he saved Israel in the middle of all that. Syria and Egypt thought that they could knock off Israel with the help of Russians. And Nixon, who was great at international affairs, stepped up and said, we got to help the Israelis, send everything that we've got. And the Israelis know that they might have been not defeated completely, but they would have been invaded without his help. So that was a big deal. On the other hand, he kept thinking if he moved parts around on the board, he could get around this somehow. And even his aides knew that they were playing a losing game, because there were voices on that tape that made it clear the president knew what was going on. And what I must say about the press is that the press played it very carefully. I was at lunch one day with one of my very closest friends in the White House press corps. He was my age. He was from Kansas City, worked for the Wall Street Journal. And we were, this was sometime in January, I think. And I said, Fred, it doesn't make any difference. It makes sense what they're doing now. It just doesn't make any sense. He said, until you remember he's guilty. I said, oh yeah, that. But I never went on the air and said he's guilty. And neither did Fred write it for the Wall Street Journal. We let the facts take us where we were going to go.